Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. In today's episode, we turn to some of the most basic questions about the Crusades and the establishment of the Latin states of the Holy Land. Who were these crusaders and settlers? Why did Western European nobles and commoners take the cross and undertake an arduous 2,000-mile journey, knowing that they would be facing a formidable enemy at its end? And who were the settlers who either went on crusade and stayed behind, and those who came not as crusaders, but as colonists? I'm very pleased to have as my very special guest a historian who has dealt with these questions in his research and publications, Dr. Steve Tibble. Steve, welcome to "'Tis But a Scratch."
Thank you, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here.
But before we begin, I'm going to give you a proper introduction. Steve is a graduate of Cambridge and London universities and is a research associate at Royal Holloway College, University of London. He's the author of 5 books. The first, Monarchy and Lordship in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, 1099 to 1291, which I assume was your dissertation, turned into a book, published by Oxford University Press in 1990. Now we have a gap. And the gap is explained because Steve had a career in the communications industry specializing in financial markets. After he retired, he returned to his first love, the history of the Crusades. And I have to admit, I'm in awe of your productivity. Between 2018 and 2024, Steve published 4 books with Yale University Press. And let me explain to our listeners, that means that in paperback, they are actually affordable. Yale is good for that. These books are The Crusader Armies, 2018, The Crusader Strategy, 2020, Templars, The Knights Who Made Britain, 2024, and most recently and provocatively, Crusader Criminals, The Knights Who Went Rogue in the Holy Land, and that's just been released. I should also mention that Steve is the author of the chapters on warfare and strategy in both the Oxford Illustrated History of the Crusades and the Cambridge History of the Crusades. I can't think of anyone more qualified to explain the motivations of the Crusaders and the settlers in the Holy Land than Steve. So,
thank you, Richard. No pressure whatsoever.
No pressure whatsoever. But since this podcast contrasts popular conceptions of the Middle Ages with their historical reality, let's begin with some popular conceptions of the motivations of Crusaders. I'd like to get your reaction to 2 brief audio clips. The first is a movie trailer for the 1948, important date, 1948, re-release of Cecil B. DeMille's 1935 epic, The Crusades.
Now, as the eyes of the world focus upon Palestine, Paramount re-presents Cecil B. DeMille's mighty production, The Crusades, preserving for all the ages the glory of Palestine's most spectacular struggle, the War of the Faiths. This is the glorious love story of the age of chivalry, when faith in God carried the flower of knighthood on history's most gallant quest. Faith that gave strength to Christian women sold in the slave marts of the Saracens. Faith that sent Christian soldiers into battle against the mighty host of Islam.
So what we have is, with the Cecil B. DeMille's version of it, we have the old idea that these are pious people inspired by their love of their fellow Christians and by the terrible things that the Muslims are doing. I mean, enslaving Christian women who turn out all to be blonde and who are obviously facing a fate worse than death.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Look at this gold Christian hair!
As it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us
For
our
your 36th
as we forgive those who
all the Christian captives, not one, not
Not
four,
temptation.
slender, 37 and no more, 37 souls. And may Allah give you joy. Captives, this is the bell.
The cross! The cross! Let me kiss the cross!
This is, after all, a Cecil B. DeMille epic.
And now for something completely different.
The second audio clip is from the first episode of an educational television series, Timeline, that aired on PBS in 1989. This was an American, British, Spanish, Turkish venture that presented historical events from the Middle Ages in the style of a modern newscast. The episode, entitled Crusades, is set in the year 1187 during the negotiations for the surrender of Jerusalem to Saladin. Christian residents of Jerusalem are anxious because 100 years earlier, the First Crusade had culminated in a massacre of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city. To provide historical context, a reporter explains why European knights had undertaken the First Crusade, which is further explained by preserved footage of an interview with two representative knights.
Roland, spake Oliver, your elephant now sound, that Charles the King may...
For younger sons with no inheritance and knights without land, the crusade offered the opportunity for fulfilling their two main needs: loot and some good fighting.
Think it's cheap going to war? I have to provide my own horse, armour, sword, and go running off every time my liege lord wants some company for a little fighting.
But at least we're fighting for something we believe in. We're fighting God's holy war. I mean, his land's in chains and we're off to do something about it.
You're only going to Jerusalem because the Pope said he'd forgive your sins if you went there. He's got enough sins for the whole army.
Look, I want to liberate the holy city. Now, if I manage to liberate some land and a saucy little Saracen girl at the same time, well, it just goes to show that I'm fighting on the side of the angels.
Basically, you have what some would call the greedy younger sons explanation for Crusades, that because primogeniture was the reigning inheritance protocol, that you had a bunch of younger noble sons who were facing poverty or facing having to get some kind of patronage, and they saw the Crusades as an opportunity to get land and wealth. So let's start with those explanations.
Gosh, where to begin?
Yeah.
In fairness, there is a kernel of truth in both of those views.
I agree, though both are extreme versions of the truth. They do remind us, however, that there were multiple reasons, multiple motivations for going on crusade.
Gosh, where to begin?
Yeah.
In fairness, there is a kernel of truth in both of those views. The audio clip we've heard from dear Cecil, that is a caricature, but it is equally true that piety was an important motivator.
Yes.
These times were times when people were pious to an extent that I think we would find very hard to imagine. Even if you're a religious person now, if you go to mass every week, it's still a different world. These were people who really believed that their immortal souls were at risk if they swore an oath and broke it.
And the early church developed the sacrament of penance and reconciliation as a mechanism for providing remission of sin to those who confess and who right themselves with God by paying for that sin through an act of contrition. By the 11th century, penance was conceived theologically as necessary for satisfying divine justice. The severity of the penance prescribed by a priest was to be based on the seriousness of the sin. The most common penances included fasting, the recitation of prayers, and almsgiving, and for more serious sins, the undertaking of pilgrimages. And this brings us back to the Crusades. What distinguishes a crusade from other forms of Christian holy war is that a crusade is penitential warfare.
Absolutely.
Here are some historical context I think would be useful. The idea of the crusade represents a fundamental shift in Christian attitudes towards warfare. The early Christian church was pacifistic, but after the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, it became necessary to moderate that pacifism to allow Christian soldiers to defend what by the end of that century had become a Christian empire. St. Augustine accomplished this by essentially baptizing Cicero's Roman just war theory. Christians, Augustine taught, had a duty to fulfill public services out of love of neighbor. They also have a duty to obey their rulers, whose authority derives from the Lord God, and that comes from St. Paul to the Romans, chapter 13. This duty extends to military service. A Christian ruler, Augustine wrote, must only engage in just wars. Drawing upon Cicero, St. Ambrose in Scripture, Augustine posited that to be just, a war, 1, must have proper authority, that is, it must be waged by the legitimate rulers of a state. 2, must have a just cause, that is, it must be fought in defense of the patria, of the country, or in defense of an ally, or to avenge injuries. And 3, must have rightful intention, and that intention must have as its goal the restoration of peace. Augustine's ideas about warfare and the duties of a Christian ruler and his Christian subjects in the city of man created competing mandates for laymen in the early Middle Ages. On the one hand, Christian kings had a duty to defend subjects, care for the weak, do justice, and protect the church, while subjects had a duty to obey the king as God's lawful authority on earth and to serve the king in arms if called upon. On the other hand, the church continued to teach that all homicide is sinful. Despite Augustine's just war doctrine, the early medieval church continued to require penance from soldiers who killed others, even if the killing was done in a just war by order of a legitimate lord. This created a dilemma for knights. On the one hand, their duty was to fight on behalf of their lords, but to do so was to incur sin that needed to be expiated. Some squared this by founding monasteries peopled with monks who would pray for them. Others by retiring to monasteries at the end of their lives. Others simply relied on the sacraments. But the idea of the crusade as preached by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095 offered a knight the opportunity to get right with God, not by abandoning his profession of arms, but by exercising it in the service of God and his church. A crusade was an armed pilgrimage that served as full penance for all confessed sins. Neither Urban II nor the Emperor Alexius Comnenus, who had appealed to the Pope to recruit knights to help him recover Byzantine territory lost to the Turks, were prepared for the massive response that the Pope's appeal generated. The promise of remission of sin and the desire to aid God and one's fellow Christians appealed to peasants and knights alike, but the idea that one could pay for one's sins by fighting must have had a special appeal to the knighthood.
I think you're absolutely right. And I know it's always difficult to find quantitative data in the Middle Ages, but I think you've hit the nail on the head. The numbers involved are so huge that speaks enormously to the piety and the genuine religiosity of these people, and that's true on all sides in the Crusades. I mean, so on the one hand, we look at them and think, okay, but they're like us, but we continually have to keep reminding ourselves that they have cultural references that are way beyond our current experience. However often you go to mass or synagogue or to the temple, we can't compare to them. I mean, it is hard to imagine the level of religiosity they have. So that is reflected in the huge enthusiasm for the First Crusade. And actually, the thing that surprises me more, really, is how long the crusading movement lasted. It's effectively an unwinnable battle. You've got 200 years of unwinnable fights being played out, just a huge defensive campaign, of a tiny, what's effectively a tiny Christian fringe on the edge of a great Islamic empire. And And yet people still keep coming. You find people are still leaving France, leaving Germany, giving up their lands, giving up their lives, leaving their families for a cause that, we would say logically, is a lost cause. However much you might want to defend the Christian communities in the Holy Land, you can see directionally which way it's going to end.
I completely agree about the role played by religious enthusiasm in explaining the enduring popularity of crusading. But at least in the case of knights, we need to appreciate two other complementary motivations: the hope for material rewards and the social obligation of following one's earthly as well as one's divine Lord. Taking the cross was an individual and voluntary act, but knights also went either as members of a lord's retinue or would join a retinue while on crusade, and the line of demarcation that most of us draw between pure spiritual and base material motivations is a product of the dominant modern secular culture. Leon Eaton, the director and scriptwriter of the Timeline series, presumably with the help of Dr. Janet Mizell, the episode's historical advisor, captured the intertwined expectations and motivations of at least some of those who took the cross.
We're fighting God's holy war. I mean, his land's in chains and we're off to do something about it.
You're only going to Jerusalem because the Pope said he'd forgive your sins if you went there. He's got enough sins for the whole army.
Look, I want to liberate the holy city. Now, if I manage to liberate some land and a saucy little Saracen girl at the same time, well, it just goes to show that I'm fighting on the side of the angels.
When I would play that clip in class, I could be sure that at least one student would accuse this clearly impious knight of hypocrisy. And I was grateful for that, because that would serve as a launching pad for a discussion of cultural assumptions. I would explain to the students that the medieval culture of chivalry was shaped by the ethos of reciprocity. Knights took oaths on holy relics to serve their lord with loyalty and love, but they did so in expectation that their lords would return that love with appropriate material rewards. How much more could one expect from pledging one's life, loyalty, and service to the greatest of the lords, the Lord God? There is no contradiction in a knight taking the cross out of genuine religious enthusiasm, but also with the expectation, or at least the hope, that you're going to be rewarded if you die with the kingdom of heaven, but if you live, you're going to be rewarded with material gifts, just like any good Lord would give you.
Absolutely. And I think, human beings, we're complex creatures, and we can hold multi-positional views that are contradictory, but hold them simultaneously. And I think the Crusades is a very good example of that. Exactly as you said, you find people like Scandinavian Crusaders coming down. I mean, these are still basically Vikings in terms of...
Yes.
And they go all the way down the coast, the Atlantic coast. They fight their way all the way across the coast of North Africa, doing whatever Vikings do, which is, obviously pretty ghastly. Occasionally they do it to Christians, sort of by accident on the way. And when they get there, they all pile out of their boats and get very religious, and then go to the Holy Sepulchre and perform their devotions, take off their shoes and walk barefoot down to the Jordan. And they're not being, the thing that surprises us is that they're not being hypocritical. They genuinely aren't. These are people who are simultaneously, psychopathic pilgrims and at the same time genuinely pious. And there isn't really a contradiction in that. You see that exactly the same with, say, the Italian communities. So you find the Italian navvies come over, the earlier days of the Crusades, and these guys are really hard-nosed businessmen. These are venture capitalists, private equity. They're the epitome of commerciality in the Middle Ages, and yet genuinely pious. Sometimes you'll find if they're dividing up the shares of the spoil when they capture a city, they'll give up an entire quarter of the city for a single holy relic to take back to Genoa and claim that they've got the Holy Grail in their cathedral. And it's this wonderful kind of childlike piety alongside the most ferocious capitalist endeavor and materialism, and which seems strange to our eyes, but it wasn't strange to them at all.
Also helps explain how the Fourth Crusade gets diverted first to sacking the Christian city of Zara, and then ends up in Constantinople and taking Constantinople. And it probably helped that the Christians of Constantinople were not Roman Catholic Christians when they took it.
Absolutely. And it helped that they'd also, attacked the Frankish and Italian communities a few years earlier. So it was payback time, plus an opportunity to effectively mine for some wonderful relics and bring them back.
But, that's also the point, is that we might think of the relics as being souvenirs, or we might think of them as tourist attractions. But they thought of the relics as being sources of spiritual power. That these are real. These get you in touch with God and the holy, with the saints. And I don't think we have currently a real sense of just how important a relic is.
Yeah, absolutely the same way. As you said, I think the word touch is a very important one. And again, we tend to mock relics as being, clearly, we think of them as like frauds or spurious or whatever. But at the time, I think for most people that was not the case. They suspended disbelief because these relics put them in touch. It was a tangible connection to the spiritual world, and that was so important.
And we see it militarily with the Holy Lance of Antioch, which Monty Python does a nice job of making fun of with their holy hair grenade. But as I've said before, there is more historical truth in Monty Python and the Holy Grail than one might expect. No, there wasn't a holy hand grenade of Antioch. But in 1098, during the siege of Antioch, a holy lance did the trick. The discovery through a miraculous vision of what was believed to be the lance that had pierced Christ's side on the cross inspired a starving and up to that point demoralized crusading army to win an unlikely victory over a much larger Turkish relief force.
Absolutely, and the same with the True Cross. I mean, basically these items, it seems strange to us, but these items were spiritual secret weapons, and they could be carried with an army, and they would raise morale, they would raise the fighting spirit, they'd give you offensive power when you needed to be aggressive, and they provided a center for defense when you needed something to rally around. And that was one of the shocking things about the Battle of Hattin, is that the big relic, the most important relic, was lost. Yep. And although there are so many fragments of it around Europe that we could probably recreate another one, we never had the whole one again.
Let's return briefly to numbers. My old friend John France, in his Military History of the First Crusade, Victory in the East, estimates that perhaps as many as 80,000 Crusaders reached Byzantium during the First Crusade. 20,000 of these belonged to Peter the Hermit's People's Crusade, and of those, only about 3,000 survived their first encounter with the Turks in Asia Minor. France estimates that the crusading army at its height numbered around 50,000 to 60,000, and that includes non-combatants.
Certainly possible. I mean, it's huge. I mean, I don't think they knew the numbers, so I wouldn't ever pretend that I know. But it's a very big number, particularly by the standards of the time. And it comes back to your quantitative point about the origins of piety. How do you prove piety? Well, just look at the numbers.
This is an immense force for the Middle Ages, but what equally strikes me is how diminished in size that army was when it finally reached Jerusalem 2 years after its first encounter with the Turks in Asia Minor. Raymond of Aguirre, Count Raymond of Toulouse's chaplain and an eyewitness, estimated the army that arrived at Jerusalem in June of 1099 as consisting of 1,200 to 1,300 knights and about 20,000 other armed men. Medieval chroniclers are notoriously unreliable when it comes to numbers, but their tendency was to exaggerate, not to minimize, and at least John France regards these figures as reasonable. So my question is, what explains this dramatic attrition rate?
And I think you can overestimate the deterioration of the military impact, because there is a there's clearly a Darwinistic element to this. Guys who start off as being fairly new to warfare and without great armor, if they've survived the horrors that they've been through, they've probably picked up better armor from the guys around them, and they're probably very, very good at their trade. So you have a kind of a distillation process. I think as you go through, not everybody, the numbers go down. It's not always by death. I think a lot of people.
Oh, my favorite. Stephen of Blois is my favorite Crusader for the First Crusade. Unfortunately, married to the daughter of William the Conqueror and being compared unfavorably by his wife to her father. Stephen goes home at Antioch, figures he has fulfilled his Crusader vow, and gets hell from his wife, and is finally forced to go back and do the proper thing and die on Crusade.
Absolutely, and he did die properly on Crusade. In fairness to him, he died in a very good charge. So he died properly.
He died properly.
But what a father-in-law to have, eh? That would go back to that happy family.
But it's a nice warning that if you don't fulfill your vow, it's not simply that you're in bad with God. You're also have disgraced yourself. You have dishonored yourself. You dishonored your family.
Absolutely. I think the interesting thing is how many people did leave after they'd captured Jerusalem, because in a way that's something that's discussed less. I mean, it's if you leave it from Antioch, you're obviously a coward. But most of the army, I mean, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4, seem to have just cleared off back to Europe very soon after Jerusalem had been taken. Perhaps large numbers were around for the Battle of Ascalon, but that was only a few months later. And it was that, to me, shows the level of it kind of dispels the old Marxist idea about greed. The idea that these younger sons were out there because they were proto-capitalist imperialists trying to carve out lands for themselves. I mean, it's obviously true for some people. But actually, the majority of guys, even the ones that survived, had bankrupted themselves to go on crusade. They'd put their lives at risk every day while they're on crusade. And then as soon as they'd achieved their vow, they went home, financially much worse off, probably with their health broken. And yet, these were most of the people on the First Crusade. They weren't doing it for cash.
Yeah, Jonathan Riley-Smith did, I thought, a very, very big service to the discipline by actually investigating the cost of going on crusade and the motivations. And among the things he pointed out is just how expensive it was to outfit yourself to going on crusade, how unlikely it was after the First Crusade. People were going knowing more what to expect. It was unlikely that you were going to make a fortune. It was unlikely that you were going to do anything but maybe get yourself killed. And people still embrace the Crusades. And what Jonathan Riley-Smith pointed out, it's really about piety. If you look at the charters, and this was Giles Constable also, it's about piety. People are embracing this idea of, especially if you're a knight, as Bernard of Clairvaux. If you stay in Europe, you're going to be killing Christians and you're going to be damning yourself with your profession of arms. But here is an opportunity to use your profession of arms and to win a greater kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. I mean, it's a wonderful pitch, but it's a pitch that works because this is really believed. We have to, I think, get rid of the 19th century secular cynicism that really shaped so much of the ideas about the Crusades in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I think you can see where this kind of secular, cynical approach came from. And if you are very cynical, that is an explanation. But as Jonathan Riley-Smith pointed out and proved beyond doubt, that doesn't stand up to examination. I was very lucky. Jonathan was my supervisor at Cambridge back in the 1970s.
I know how fortunate you feel to have studied under him while he was developing his ideas about the Crusades. Your seminars and tutorials must have been extraordinary. Raleigh Smith pretty much was responsible for the revival of interest in the Crusades in the Anglophone academic world.
Yeah, and he was such a nice guy as well. He was a genuinely kind, supportive man. I think it was partly because he was so clever. He didn't have anything to prove. So, when he had me and my friends as his PhD students, he used us effectively as his research assistants, writing the books that he didn't have time to write, but never took any credit away from us. Gave us far more support than we could have expected. And, he was really one of the most... and I think as you say, he effectively invented the modern crusading industry, such as it is, and put it on much more evidentially based lines rather than theoretical, say Marxist approaches looking at how evil imperialists might develop over time.
I was wondering whether one of the reasons why you had so many of the Crusaders on the First Crusade return to Europe is because of their disappointment when they finally hit the Holy Land and discovered it wasn't a land of milk and honey, but it was a place that was not what they expected. The Franciscan monk Salimbeni wrote that when Frederick II, quote, saw the Holy Land, which God had so oft times commended as a land flowing with milk and honey and most excellent above all lands, it pleased him not, and he said that if the God of the Jews had seen his land of Calabria, Sicily, and Apulia, then he would not so have commended the land which he promised to the Jews, end quote.
Well, he is right, of course, but I think you're having a jocular view there. I think it is primarily they just thought it was job done. They had a vow, and
they had fulfilled that vow.
Yeah, it was. To me, it's a kind of shallow view of what that vow was. They were coming to liberate Jerusalem, which they did within their own context. They did, but in terms of that vow, they saw it as an action rather than a process. So the action of liberating it was a one-off thing. What they didn't really appreciate was that actually it's a process. The process of defending it is much more difficult and probably much more important. But in terms of the vow, they were probably literally correct.
After taking Jerusalem and then the critical port of Ascalon, now in southern Israel, about 8 miles north of the Gaza border, the majority of the surviving Crusaders embarked for home. Only a small remnant remained to defend the territories taken from the Turks. In a letter to the Pope, the three most important leaders of the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon, Dibert, Archbishop of Pisa, and Count Raymond, appealed for recruits. They explained that any one of the coastal cities still held by the Muslims had more men than the entire crusading army. Now, as you point out, most Crusaders felt that they had fulfilled their oath and duty and were now returning home with a plenary indulgence, perhaps a bag filled with relics, and a lot of good stories to tell about their great adventure. So my question to you is, who stayed behind and why?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I suspect that every Crusader had his own different take on why they stayed. And it's easy to see why people would go, because they've got families, they've achieved the vow, it's job done. The guys who stay, I assume, are a combination of people, some of whom are just genuinely very pious. They're, for instance, like the guys who, over time, are going to become the Templars, seem to be hanging around. They were kind of the flotsam of the Crusade, a handful of people who were hanging around guarding the relics in the Holy Sepulchre or something like that. And, so there's the thing that you talked about earlier where knights were genuinely after remission of sins, and they were genuinely more pious than we can imagine. So I think those guys, the ones who are at the kind of extreme end of that religiosity, would have been motivated to stay.
I'd put Count Raymond of Toulouse into that category. In contrast to the Norman opportunists Bohemond and Tancred, Raymond could have returned to rule a prosperous county in southern France. He chose to stay.
I think there would have been some poor people who didn't have much to go back for. And we know that, very soon after the First Crusade, people are settling down in villages, they're marrying local women, they're being given much more freedoms than they had in Europe. They're a scarce commodity. They're warm bodies prepared to defend the Holy Land are in high demand, so you have to be nice to them. It's sort of like peasant labour after the Black Death. Suddenly there's a kind of wage inflation and there's a kind of respect inflation. So I think as a poor person, as a poor European, after the First Crusade, you had more respect than if you'd gone home and carried on moving your lord's manure from one end of the field to the other. It must have been in some ways a more attractive prospect for the more adventurous spirits. And you do find I think that is the kind of the go east young man kind of effect, where people who haven't got a lot to go back for settle down and put down roots, and primarily, by and large, certainly in the Latin Kingdom, are marrying Arab women. And what we forget, of course, is that when we talk about Arab women, we're not primarily talking about Muslim women, but these are Arab Christians, because the majority of the population of the Crusader States were Christian throughout this period.
Which is a really important point, which is ignored. The assumption is that what you have is this small European colony, little islands of power, and they're dominating a Arab Muslim population that is resentful, angry, and waiting to be liberated. And that's pretty much the portrayal that you get in the Egyptian film Saladin, where although that film is willing to admit that there are Arab Christians and they also hate the Crusaders equally. But this isn't what the sources actually tell us. An increasing body of archaeological evidence is revealing the surprisingly large extent of Frankish rural settlement. And as you point out, the majority of native residents of the Crusader states were in fact Arab Christians. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had a larger Muslim population than the other states, but what is striking is that the relations between the Muslim peasants and their Frankish rulers tended to be harmonious. In 1184, the Spanish Arab traveler Ibn Jabaya spent 32 days in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Much to his surprise, he found the Christian residents to be tolerant of the Muslim faith. Those Christians who lived around Mount Lebanon, for instance, quote, when they see any Muslim hermits, bring them food and treat them kindly, saying that these men are dedicated to great and glorious God, and that they should therefore share with them, end quote. He was disturbed to find that Frankish landlords treated their Muslim peasant tenants better than Turkish Muslim landlords treated theirs, quote. Our way lay through continuous farms and ordered settlements, whose inhabitants were all Muslims, living comfortably under Frankish rule. They surrender half their crops to the Franks at harvest time and pay as well a poll tax of 1 dinar and 5 carats for each person. Other than that, they are not interfered with, except for a light tax on the fruit of their trees. The houses and all their effects are left to their full possession. All the coastal cities occupied by the Franks are managed in this fashion. Their rural districts, the villages and farms belong to the Muslims, but their hearts have been seduced, for they observe how unlike them in ease and comfort are their brethren in the Muslim regions under their Muslim governors. This is one of the misfortunes afflicting the Muslims. The Muslim community bewails the injustice of the landlord of its own faith and applauds the conduct of its opponent and enemy, the Frankish landlord, and is accustomed to justice from him, end quote. What's remarkable about this is that this is 1184, at a time when Saladin was invading the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
I know, you're absolutely right. He finds that very irritating. And you can see why. I mean, there's a couple of different points there. I think there's one big point, which is that the Franks are foreigners. Actually, by the time Ibn Jabaya's wandering around in the 1180s, most of them are not ethnic foreigners in the way that we talk about them.
Yeah.
Most of them are mixed race at this point. Even the kings of Jerusalem, they're all mixed race. So it's not like they are outlandish foreigners. They've intermarried, and on top of that, the majority of the population are Christian anyway. The local guys are Christian, whether they're Arabs or Armenians or Syrians or what have you. So it is partly because we see a Middle East that is primarily Muslim at the moment. So we're kind of lazy and we just assume that what we see now is what was always there. And of course, that isn't the case. The Middle East was Christian before the Muslim invasions, and it remains so for most of the Crusades. Gradually over time, that's very gradually changed. But the other thing to remember is that Saladin was more of a foreigner than the kings of Jerusalem.
He's a Kurd.
I mean, he had no Arab blood, or Armenian blood. The kings of Jerusalem were all from mixed race families. Well, a lot of them were from the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin was a Kurd, which is, a foreign semi-nomadic force. Most of his troops were foreign Turks, again, semi-nomadic. In Egypt, they were presiding over armies that were mostly made up from Armenians and sub-Saharan Africans. So I think we look back and assume that the Crusaders were somehow the foreign interlopers, whereas in fact, within a couple of generations, they were probably the least foreign of the governments in the area.
The popular conception doesn't take into account that the local population, both the Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, have been recently subjugated by the Turks. So it's not that these had been people who are living under their own rulers and their own, they were already a subjugated people. It was a question who was going to rule them, not whether they were going to rule themselves.
Absolutely. And again, I think, religion is obviously very important. If you look at it as a kind of proximate cause and as a proximate motivator, religion looms large. But if you look at the ultimate cause, I think you could write a history of the Crusades that didn't mention Christianity or Islam. It's, you can talk about primal anthropological forces like, to me, the big driver is how climate change forces nomadic populations into areas occupied by sedentary populations. So it's largely a conflict between sedentary governments and nomadic ones. And ironically, it's the Muslim sedentary governments that get given a good kicking first. We tend to be very Eurocentric and assume it's, all about Muslims against Christians. But in fact, the Turks were displaced and gave a good kicking to all the local Syrian Arab groups that they came across. And they attacked and took over the Egyptian sedentary societies that were facing them as well. I think the other big issue is to remember that the Crusaders weren't being altruistic, I don't think. They weren't behaving like this because they were Mother Teresa. They were doing it because they really didn't have a lot of choice. I mean, these were guys who were hugely outnumbered with very little cash. So the last thing you want is a disgruntled peasantry. What you want are people on the ground who form militia, join your army, and help to defend themselves. And for instance, when there are things like a legal system to think about, you're quite happy to set up local governments so that where there are Muslim communities, they have their own courts, they swear on the Quran, and they have equal rights in conflict against Frankish settlers as well. It's too expensive to do anything other than try and be nice.
This attitude of religious toleration and cultural accommodation shocks the hell out of new crusaders from the West, who come and find that the people that they've come to help and rescue seem to have gone native on them. And you get the unflattering term Polani about these people. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing is that Polani seems to imply that they're of mixed race, but the reality is that they are of mixed race, that these are individuals who have intermarried with the locals, and the families they may call themselves Franks, they may identify themselves culturally as Franks, but they are a product of that world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always been slightly shocked at how little racism there is in the Crusades, which may sound a bit odd because we're fairly obsessed with it at the moment. But their cultural dividing lines are very, very rarely about ethnicity. And it's one of the things that makes looking at the composition of the Frankish population so interesting is you find odd references that prove that entire units of the army were not just mixed race, but were entirely Arab, for instance. and there are Arab knights. But then within 2 generations, they've all changed their names. Their sons started off as, so-and-so Arabi, and then within 1 generation, they're called Baldwin, and they're just signing themselves in charge as Baldwin. So there's an indeterminate but very large number of people who are not just mixed race, but actually wholly Arab or Syrian, operating, and it's so commonplace and so expected that people don't mention it.
It's religiously
taken for granted.
It's religiously tolerant compared to the West. The West is with the rise of the papal monarchy, and the creation of not a formal inquisition, but inquisitorial procedures. What you have in the West is the attempt to be able to impose uniformity of practice, uniformity of belief, and there in the Latin states of the Holy Land, you have a bewildering variety of Christians who would be considered heretics in the West, and yet living side by side with basic religious toleration.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's probably the biggest irony. Because the kind of cynical, secular preconception is that the Crusaders are the most intolerant of Europeans and the most fanatical about things like religion or race, and it couldn't be further from the truth. And again, you come back to this thing that it's not altruism. These are people, well, they can't afford to do otherwise. You can't alienate people who would be called heretics in some parts of Europe at some times. These are the people who are paying your tax. They're the people who are filling the ranks in the army. You also, and I think this is a bigger issue, you can't get on your high horse because your king is mixed race, because your lord is probably mixed race, because you're probably mixed race. There's a much greater sense of tolerance than you would expect. And again, we have a very perverse caricature of the Crusader States.
Well, you have that wonderful story that Usama ibn Munkid tells about he's visiting Jerusalem, he's visiting the Temple Mount, and there is this place that's been laid out for Muslims to worship. And he goes there, and he has a group of Templars who he knows and are maybe not friends, but they are friendly acquaintances. And he goes to pray, and he prays towards the south, towards Mecca. And a new crusader right off the boat from France gets really upset. And he's not upset that this is a Muslim prayer, because he has probably no idea that it's a Muslim. He's upset because he's praying in the wrong direction. He should be praying towards the east, and he picks him up and he tries to turn him over to the east and gets shuffled out by the Templars, who then apologize to Usama. There's nothing we can do about these guys just off the boat. They're not really civilized.
No, you're absolutely right. What can we do? But that sums it up very well. And actually, the Templars again. They've got this caricature reputation now as being fanatical psychos, and their image partially has been taken over by right-wing groups who,
oh God, yes,
say in Central Europe or some other parts of the world, who associate them with white supremacy. It couldn't be further from the truth. As you pointed out there, they were in some ways, most sophisticated in terms of their relationships with their enemies and neighbors. But also, I think, most Templar armies were actually mostly Arabs or Syrians anyway. The brothers themselves probably weren't, though some of them were mixed race, I imagine.
It strikes me that one of the military problems is that the goals of the settlers and the rulers of the Latin states are so different from the goals of the numbered crusades. You come in from Western Europe, you're coming in order to fight and to fulfill your vow and then to go home. And if you're living there, what you want above all else is survival. You don't want to create a situation because you know they're going to go home. You know that this massive army is only here for that period of time, and any territory that they gain you're then looking at how the hell do we hold it?
Absolutely. That's the sad heritage of the First Crusade. The First Crusade was, a stonking success, but incredibly lucky. You know what I mean? So it created this sense that the Crusades were a military panacea for all else. And in fact, it was the opposite. What you really needed was a standing army, which is why the papacy, God bless them, actually had this profoundly clever idea, which was creating military orders that would form at least some kind of kernel of an army that was, at least approximated to something that was standing. Whereas all of the numbered crusades, as you quite rightly say, are effectively just, hugely violent pilgrimages. So these are people who are coming and then going. And it comes back to what we were saying about earlier with regards to why people went home. They saw crusading as a single act that would allow you remission of sins. And once that act was done, then your remission was in place, and off you go back to see the wife and kids who you haven't seen for 2 or 3 years. So it's understandable, but it's as a strategic arm to defend the Holy Land, it's appalling. It's not a great solution. What you need is warm bodies on the ground permanently, which goes back to our other point and explains why these were not intolerant societies, because they couldn't ever afford to be. They needed all the help they could get.
And it also, because of the constant state of war, as you've pointed out, this area is a magnet for young men, violent young men, well-armed young men who are coming in because they'll always be able to find an occupation as a mercenary. Mercenaries are going to be used on both sides. And if you have a lot of young males, well-armed, ruthless, and without really any kind of stake in society, what you're going to end up having is a lot of crime. And although we have been emphasizing religious enthusiasm as a primary motivation for the Crusades, at least some men took the cross for much less pious reasons. Those who took a crusading vow received not only spiritual, but temporal privileges. From the earliest Crusades on, this included protection of property, and one way to escape the loss of land in a legal dispute was by taking a crusader vow. By the beginning of the 13th century, the cruce signati, those signed by the cross, also received exemption from the jurisdiction of secular courts for crimes. In essence, crusaders received temporary clerical immunity. Kings insisted that this be limited to lesser crimes, but at least in France, bishops ignored the limitation. King Louis IX, Saint Louis of all people, complained to the Pope that, quote, because of the liberty granted them, those signed with the cross commit robbery, homicide, rape, and other detestable crimes. In answer, Pope Innocent IV in 1246 ordered the French clergy not to defend crusaders in such crimes, inasmuch as he was, quote, quite unwilling that their liberty should be made an occasion for excesses, end quote. Apparently, the French clergy continued to protect those who had taken the vow, because in 1260, Louis had to appeal once again to the papacy, and Pope Alexander IV ordered the French clergy not to interfere with the king, his bailiffs, his provosts, his barons, or his nobles from, quote, proceeding against lay crusaders in enormous crimes which require capital punishment, any custom to the contrary notwithstanding. I don't imagine these guys behaved any better while they were fulfilling their oaths. And so the Holy Land becomes a hotbed of criminal activity, which is like one of the great ironies.
Absolutely. It's the Wild East. I think you're absolutely right. The clue is now, we have the luxury of Google Maps or equivalent. The Crusaders didn't. But if you have a look at Google Map and you see where all the fighting, where the Crusader States are, where all the big battles are, they loom large in our minds as medieval historians. But then if you zoom out from Google Maps and look at where people are coming from, you just see it's a tiny sliver of land. You've got people coming from as far afield as Ireland on the Atlantic coast, from Central Africa being brought up as mercenaries or slaves. You've got Turkic lads coming in from almost over to China. and everybody in between. It's just this massive vortex. And if you stand back for a couple of minutes and think, okay, what's going to happen? What is the consequence of this? You're absolutely right. What happens is not just violence on the battlefield, but you have violence through all levels of society, and it is hugely destabilizing.
Much more violent than Western Europe. As you point out in your book, Crusader Criminals, the Latin states lacked a legal system that could cope with that level of violence and with so many malefactors. You can have laws, but laws need to be enforced. It's also because there are just so many of these young guys, and even if you're coming out of piety, once you're there, you have to make a living.
Absolutely. And if you don't have food, you have to get it somehow. That's...
If you want to learn more about criminality in the Crusader States, I strongly recommend that you get Steve's book. It's not only provocative, but it's a good, fun read. You can get a flavor of it from Danielle Sobolski's interview of Steve on the Medieval podcast, sponsored by medievalists.net. It does strike me that you have these contradictions that are so difficult for someone like myself to really understand. I'm thinking in terms of the First Crusade. Thomas of Maul is one of the Crusaders. He goes with his father on crusade, and it's an eldest son. One of the things Riley Smith did point out is that we have a lot of eldest sons going on crusade. This is not just the younger sons who are going on crusade. And Thomas of Maul is the worst person that Guibert of Nojad ever met. And then he goes into the litany of the atrocities that this man has committed. And you then look at Suget's Life of Louis the Fat, and Thomas of Maul is pretty much the worst person that Suget ever met. And yet, when you look at the Chanzans for the crusading cycle, Thomas of Maul is a hero. He's the first person to enter Jerusalem during the siege. He's a horrible human being, and yet he is a crusader. And somehow those two things are able to sit in the same person.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily as contradictory as we might think. So his virtues were the virtues of a knight. They were the virtues of a soldier and somebody who was effective at killing people and doing what, in helping his cause. All the other stuff, equally true. Obviously, he's kind of scum of the earth, really, and almost uncontrollable. Even when he goes home, he's an absolute nuisance for everybody.
Yes.
But those two things can live together in the same people. These are entitled men, but also, that entitlement rested on their excellence of arms and their bravery. And that's, I think, where Stephen of Graaf fell short. He really failed to show the muscular side of what was expected of him. Whereas someone like Dear Thomas, he may have been appalling on so many personal levels, and clearly he's not somebody you'd ever want to go on a beach holiday with. But if you were in a tight spot in a siege, you could.
That's the guy you want next to you. What may be even more remarkable than the rampant criminality within the Crusader states is that the crusading armies didn't dissolve into warring factions. You have massive number of people who don't know each other, sometimes don't speak the same language, who are being thrown together for a brief period of time. These are artificial societies that come into being and then evaporate. And it's unstable.
Yeah, these are fragile environments. Yeah, and you can see why they need codes of conduct to keep them together as long as they do, and the fragile links of feudal relationships keep them together. In ways, it's surprising they kept them together as well as they did, when you consider the nature of these fairly unruly and overly entitled and heavily armed people. It's sort of like some kind of narco gang on the move, isn't it?
And I agree with you about the importance of feudal bonds as a mechanism for maintaining order within crusading armies. And yes, I have used the F word. The common goal of serving God and the Church gave the Crusaders a unifying mission. but it was the hierarchical bonds of lordship that structured the units of these armies. The army is made up of people who are looking to their commanders as their lords, their personal lords. They may take the vow, but they're also the affinity of these leaders.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's, to one extent, that shows an advantage for a numbered crusade. As in the worst, thinking about criminality, for instance, the worst criminals that you find tend to be those who are, it's like the worst tourists. They're far from home, their family's behind, they're probably drinking too much. They're very disinhibited, and there's very little, they don't have the links to society to hold them in place. Whereas these crusades, as you quite rightly mentioned, they have social hierarchical links. And because they are about to go home, they're not quite as, you know what I mean? They're because they are temporary expeditions, they're not completely adrift. Where you find huge criminality is, say, when you get a nomadic tribe that comes down and then it fragments, it goes into different mercenary groups. Some of them are unemployed, some of them become underemployed. These are people who are maybe, 2,000 miles from home. No links, they don't have their family, they don't have their women with them. It can be, if you look at how young men behave around the world, even nowadays, if you look at, say, a narco gang or, rebels in Africa or, mercenaries on the Ukrainian war front, the things that those young, disinhibited, fully armed men get up to are not pleasant. And I think there's probably a strange degree of consistency with that over time, because it is just basic anthropology about what disinhibited, over-entitled young men get up to.
We are running out of time, so let me ask you one final question. Would you consider the settlers Crusaders?
They're not technically. In a very legal sense, they're not, because they haven't gone on this kind of pilgrimage to find remission of sins. But on the other hand, I think from a practical point of view, they were more what most ordinary people would think of as crusaders than most crusaders. I mean, most crusaders went on a journey for a couple of years to help with the defense of the Holy Land. The guys on the ground, whether they were Arab or European or Armenian or Syrian, they were fighting for the Holy Land every day of their lives, often very short lives, and they were very much on the front line. And they had to do that in the face of, I guess, some levels of disrespect. People looked down their noses on them for being Polani. They had to do it in the face of being outnumbered perennially, not knowing when help was going to come, if ever, because you never know when a crusade is going to turn up. It could be 10 years, or they could all turn up in one go and then just make themselves a complete nuisance. I mean, I have much more time for the Polani. I think I empathise with them a lot more, because I think they're brave people fighting for their local communities and living the life they're living the objectives of a crusader for a much more extended period and in a much more committed way. But that's not to denigrate, what Crusaders were trying to do. I just don't think that the Polani have had a reputational fair crack of the whip.
No, they really haven't. And I guess with that, we're pretty much out of time. This was great. Let me ask you just one final question. And this is such an unfair question, given that you've published 2 books this year. 2 books. I feel so inadequate. What's your next book?
Thank you, Richard. That's a very kind question. It's another book for Yale. It's going to be out in the autumn of next year. And it's called Assassins and Templars. Ooh. So it's looking at the way these groups used the ideology of death to leverage their presence. So it's kind of like the Aliens versus Predator of the medieval.
Oh, I love that.
And so I'm having huge fun with it. I've nearly finished. Although I have to say, in my defence, although I've had 2 books come out very recently, they've both I've been writing them for 5 or 6 years. They come out in a rush, but the process behind them does take a huge amount of time. But like you, I just love it. So To me, it's like being on holiday.
Thank you very much for joining us for the podcast. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Very kind.
Until next time, bye for now.